Well, where do we start?
How do we set the world on fire this time?
Analog versus digital.
Oh shit.
Let's go ahead and get the hard part out the way.
Okay. Analog versus in analog versus digital, are we talking about like it give me some scope because I have opinions all the way around.
Let's start with the principle. Like what are the pros of both? Like what are the things that make them cool?
Okay. Well, it depends on what we're talking about, but in general, flies.
Mm-mm.
I had my mouth open. Yeah, okay. So it depends on what we're talking about, but in general, I think digital excels at consistency and control. So if those are your primary requirements, then that depends on what we're talking about. But yeah, digital excels in consistency and control, and arguably accuracy. So um, just about anything in the digital realm is going to be more accurate, more consistent, and more easily controllable. Um, the analog realm excels at um, not much. It's not
Well, chaos primarily.
okay. So what analog actually is the real thing. So if you see, um, we never hear digital. If you understand it that way, you can't hear a digital recording
No, it's
because
just
it always
numbers.
has to get converted back to analog. So we exist in an analog world completely. Every noise that we're making as we're talking, is an analog signal. It's an actual waveform that's traveling through the air with pressure, and so analog is what we actually perceive. We don't perceive digital. Digital is just a medium of that's a good one. Digital is a medium of transport and manipulation. So now you can manipulate things in the analog world, a la distortion, but in the digital world, things are much more malleable because once it's broken down to numbers, you're just sliding numbers around. Um, so I will say, if like you're concerned with something staying true to what it was, there's a reason why people still like to listen to vinyl because it has, some of that the chaotic nature of sound pressure going through something,
I
whether it
would
be a
say, when you put a vinyl on, the it is, it's a piece of hardware.
mhm.
And even though it's a recording, it's never exactly the same.
Yeah,
Anytime you put a record on and you play it, there's a whole series of processes down from the grooves of the record to the playhead to
the
coming out the
humidity
speaker.
in the room, the ambient air temperature, all these things make a difference in ever so slight, but every time you listen to a record, it sounds a little different. You've worn the groove a little bit deeper. So yeah, sure, everything. Now that sounds like a terrible thing. It sounds awful. Um,
It's barbaric. I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
but the human beings actually prefer that. Sameness gets boring and fades into the background for human beings. So we're coming back to like pros of analog. Well, analog is interesting. That's literally it. Everything else about analog, if we're talking in a recording world, is more difficult. It is added difficulty. Yet we still torture ourselves with, analog based equipment. Yeah. Why would we do that?
It's a
It
metric ton.
Yeah, it doesn't make any
But
sense why you would want to do that, except for probably the, undeniable conclusion at this point. that if you can use the real thing, you probably want to because it feels better.
Well, there's science to that. When we talk about amps or anything like that, voltage, resistance, all that plays a role in how you react to it.
Now, if we talk about amps specifically, you know, modelers, plugins, and these flies, dude. Anyway, modelers and plugins versus real amps. Okay, what's the big difference there? You know, not much until it gets down to the nuance. When it's like, an amp is never going to behave twice on the exact same palm mute. You can take a sample of a palm mute guitar, just one sample, and you can play it you can reamp it through a guitar amp, mic that amp up, run it back in, and then just play them over and over and over again, and they will not be consistent.
No, and we've tested that.
Yeah.
Like for example, let's say we take a clip of a palm mute and we reamp it through the same amp in a sequence
Mm-hmm.
30 times over.
Yeah.
We put all 30 instances over each other. Not a single one will null another
Mm-mm.
one out in its entirety.
Right.
It might get phasey or weird,
Mm-hmm.
but it's never the same thing.
Yeah, exactly. Now that is not the case for modelers because they're algorithms. So, what goes in, there's some number crunching and that's what comes out. And it's like, some of the higher end plugins have some of that nonlinearity, built in, which is good, is better. The neural stuff does that really well. Um, but it's still, it's not the same thing. Why do we gravitate toward tube amps, over any of this stuff? Well, because it adds that extra layer of complexity that's just hard to come by. It's still why most like rock bands, if they could afford it, would prefer to record to tape, because it does sound cooler. And we don't have like a quantification for cooler except for,
Make brain feel good.
yeah,
It's
exactly.
literally
But it's chaos, and we kind of like that, it keeps us interested. It's the opposite of whatever the clock ticking effect is, where the same thing over and over again, it just falls into the background and you don't hear it anymore. And that's its own set of problems. But you know, in the guitar world, um, I don't know why, but me and everyone I know, when you hear the real amp versus the emulated amp, and God knows I've tried to love the captures and models and stuff, but it's just not there. It's useful as a tool, but man, if you have the option, you it's not the same, and not even close. Like the feel of something, when you're connected to from your instrument all the way to the air with just a voltage path. That's a much different experience than um, putting some number crunching somewhere in there along the way. And I've done all these kinds of hybrid rigs, all the way from straight up tube amps to like four cable method with digital effects and stuff to full on modelers into a power amp into a cab, and it's not even close. And when I say not even close, for me, everything is still, you know, 15 to 20% behind the
like
real deal.
what I've noticed in the modeling world, especially with profiling, because we've got Tonex, we've got a Kemper, and we've got a Quad Cortex,
Hmm.
and they all have their pros and cons. Primarily efficiency, but the thing that I've noticed, the most in the world of, we'll say profiles, or we'll say snapshots,
Hmm.
snapshots. In the world of snapshots, it's exactly just that.
Hmm.
It's a picture of that instance. And once you start messing with the settings or adjusting anything, it's that's it. It's gone.
Or you plug a different guitar into it, or like, I mean, any little thing changes, and now you don't have the tweakability left over to to get you back there.
You also don't have the reactivity. So I noticed, for example, when we were making, I say you, I was out of town. When you were making profiles
Hmm.
on the cortex of some of our rigs, I really enjoyed, for example, A being the Ubershaw and the Ubershaw snapshot.
Hmm.
But the reality is like, in that A B instance in the room, they were pretty close. But the minute you change the guitar or you have to tweak settings or get it to sit differently,
Hmm.
the snapshot becomes its own thing.
Right.
And that's, I think, where a major disconnect is. Like, you don't have that, like, you don't have this kind of reactivity where you
Right.
mess with one thing and it
Yeah. And it changes everything else.
is very,
Yeah.
again, it's efficient, but it's very two dimensional.
Well, and I don't want to, like, we talked about, there are lots of pros of digital. Like, so you're a band that has to fly all over, dude, having and I've said it before and I'll say it again. If that was what I was doing, I think out of all of the profilers, we'll call them, I would probably have a Line 6 HX effects with a Tone X pedal and a Fryette power station. That would be my fly rig. Um, and the power station is kind of unique in it was kind of designed for this purpose. It's a very neutral sounding tube power amp, but tube power amps react with cabinets way differently than solid state amps do. So you kind of get some of that pushback back into the mix when you play it. Um, it's not the same, but like I said, it's 85% there, and you can play a show on it if you're a good player and you're tight with your technique. And look, there are guitar players out there right now who have never even touched a tube amp, so they don't even know what I'm talking about.
Hurts my soul.
Well, but it's the reality. It's like there is not I remember when we were, um, you know, a decade ago when we were recording, there were drummers that would come in and try to record that had never played a real kit. You
Well,
know,
I guess this bringing it all back together, establishing kind of analog versus digital, just getting that principle underlaid. Let's talk about how that goes into our work and our philosophies, because that's where we're
yeah.
headed.
Well, so I think for it, we'll stay in the guitar amp world for a little while. The cool thing about tracking through an amplifier is like you start building a sonic identity for a song or for a record
That's
or
my
something
favorite
like that.
part.
Yeah. And foundationally, we normally start with we make decisions on a drum kit. We very old school in our approach of how we set up a recording. It's like, okay, we find a drum kit that the drummer like really gels with, and then
Sometimes we build a drum kit because we've
yeah,
got 4 or 5,
yeah,
and
out of just parts and pieces. Yeah,
it's at the point where like we might do a 24 kick,
yeah,
like an ash kick, and get something really loud and
yeah,
big, and then we'll use and that's one brand, and then
yeah,
we'll use the Pearl Master toms, and then
yeah.
we might use another kind of snare. Like
Right.
it's
And yeah, we'll hand
hardly ever the same
select
thing.
these components to like suit the kind of vibe we're going for. And that's a decision that has to be made ahead of time. That's why it's really important for bands to you know to record their own demos you know so that when you're working with a producer who's working this way, they can kind of tailor the tones and the sounds to suit the vibe of the songs.
We
But
start with everything in the room fundamentally,
yeah,
like down to from drums, from building a kit, shooting out cymbals, shells,
yeah,
to going to guitars. It's the same with guitars. We'll grab a couple of our favorite cabs if an artist has a cool cab,
hmm,
and every once in a while they do.
yeah,
We'll line up cabs and just plug stuff in the room.
hmm,
Like literally like right against this wall until something
yeah,
like hits, and then it's like, oh, and then we'll grab that and whatever feels good, put it in the booth, mic it up, and start trying stuff.
yeah. Yeah, and so, getting back to drums, like the way the drums sound kind of set the tone for everything else. So, and I always see drums as the foundational element. That's just how I hear music. But what's happening in the drums kind of dictates what else can happen. So, and then sometimes we'll go straight to guitar. I like to go to bass, first if we can, because I like the way the bass and the drums lock before anything else hits on it. But if we're still deciding on bass parts, it makes a lot of sense to go ahead and build the guitars out so that we find the pocket for the bass.
I prefer to hit bass first when possible. I think it satiates the like the side of your brain that's like
That's like
rhythm.
building a Lego castle. Yeah.
But yeah, I love Legos.
Yeah, me too.
My life is a Lego, but one singular Lego.
Just
It's in here.
a real big one.
It's a really pointy one,
Mm.
but don't step on it. But instinctively, I always like to go to bass, but creatively, it's not always the move. Especially on some of the music where we're doing a lot of like layering and
Hmm.
co-writing and building parts, because that it's, a good example is when we start experimenting with like chord inversions and
Right.
layers and like those kinds of things. Like that can really impact what a bass line might do.
Right.
So it really depends.
Yeah. So, that's never set in stone what comes next. But let's imagine we're recording a four-piece rock band. Um, guitar, bass, drums, vocals, that kind of thing. Um, it could go guitars or bass next, but we will like try to build out a tone that works in that context with uh, with whatever guitars and whatever amps like seem to suit the the arrangement, the song. Sometimes we'll change out amps or guitars per song, per part, whatever. Um, but we'll find like some core stuff that the musicians gel with, and that'll kind of be like it's very old school. It's very how they would do it in the '90s, and you know that I like '90s rock music. I think we hit a
That was
kind
a
of a peak.
plateau,
Yeah,
like of like we'll say like analog sounds. Like
yeah.
the
Was the
mid '90s was
Yeah,
amazing. The best drums, the
yeah,
biggest guitars. Like
yeah,
before things got weird and everybody got Pro Tools.
yeah. Well, and Pro Tools did us some favors, but just like anything else, it got uh, abused and mishandled because things got a little too easy. You know
Yeah,
what I mean? So there was no easy way to make a record in '92.
it had to be good.
You had to be good. And the producers have found ways around things. They had like a list of like studio musicians that they'd just call after hours. That yeah, I mean, you don't think that happened? That definitely happened. Josh Freese is on everybody's record. Like it's um but the as we take that approach, getting back to it, it really starts carving out this sonic path for the record and opening up new creative channels to do extra layers or put cool vocal parts in or whatever. The sonic identity of the record shows up long before the the first mix shows up. So one thing that like never happens anymore is big surprises in the mix. You know what I mean? There was a time when we weren't as like dedicated to crafting the sound in.
It's a twofold thing, and we'll say that 2016 to 2018, 19ish part of our career where we were doing a lot of work, we weren't charging as much, and I have no qualm about this, and no slight to anybody we've worked with, but that was a time too where we understood, on principle what our standards are, and if somebody couldn't fundamentally deliver, we had to work really hard in the edit and in the capture to get it to a level to where it was. And when you're working like that, where you're cutting things up with a scalpel and digging into the tiniest of details because an artist just doesn't have the best technique. That puts you in a place where now you're a technician, you're a surgeon, and you don't get to be as creative as much because so much of your brain power is going towards
just fixing stuff.
Correction and augmentation.
Yeah.
And that's now we typically avoid that, and the way we avoid that is with we vet everybody. We're very transparent. It's honestly, being transparent has been the best part of how we've changed our process. Because
there's never a moment where we're hiding the edit from the client.
No.
So like, and that's a huge turning point because it does two things. So when you're editing in the room with the client, when time allows, like sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it's like we got to track drums for 2 days in a row, and then we got to spend the next 3 days editing it, because you got somebody in from out of town, they've only got a couple days to be here, you just go. But when you have the time to do a song at the time and edit through it, the musicians can kind of learn where their deficiencies are, where what they're good at, what they're weak at. And normally we see musicians come in the second time and they're just better.
Oh, I mean, I observed that last weekend. We started, we're doing a record with the death metal band. They're sick, awesome guys, and the we'll say like the main guitar player, he's awesome. But we started tracking a record, and he's never done anything the way that we do. I mean, very few people do, and the entire time we're comping parts and just getting things in place. He's like, this dude's taking notes. And we had about a month of downtime. He comes in last weekend, and I noticed as we're tracking stuff, he's an arguably better guitar player, and it's because of the process. Like when you take, when you pull back the curtain and you show people, like, you let people see what happens under the hood. People can self-correct. They just need to know.
Absolutely. Yeah, and when you're, we'll say earlier in our career doing this, there's just not time to do any of that. We're seeing, 4 bands in a week. Like there's no time for someone to sit there and you like go through, hey, here's some things to work on.
We didn't have time to do that. We weren't ready.
But then that causes other problems because when the band hears that first mix, it's nothing like what they were hearing in the room.
Yeah.
Because we've gone through, fixed a bunch of stuff, probably done some reamps of things that made more sense without talking to the band, done some drum oversampling because the drum hits weren't solid or, whatever.
A biggest drum hit issue is, it's always lack of rim shots on snare drum.
Right.
Like, you want your snare drum to sound like your favorite record that's not overly sampled.
Rim shot.
Yeah. And, your favorite record that is heavily sampled, you know what sample they're using? Rim shot.
Yeah, exactly. So, and, don't get it twisted. We've been putting samples on records since the dang, 80s. Yeah, at least. Maybe before. So, ever since MIDI was a thing.
That was 82, I believe. Somebody will tell me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, people have been dropping samples on records. So, but it's never gotten in the way of the drum sound the way that it does now. Like now, we don't even hear the drums anymore. We hear samples.
Well, and what we're seeing, and this goes back to the analog versus digital, the fundamental, because we're very hybrid, but there is this thing that's happening in production where I call it defaulting, and it's like, especially in the world of upcoming mixers, like that's a very contentious thing for me as a tracking engineer and as a producer, is when we don't work with a lot of external people at this point. There's a handful that we have worked with, and those have been some A-list guys, and they've done pretty awesome. But most of the time when I send something out to a we'll say like mid-level mixer, and again, this doesn't happen a lot anymore.
Yeah.
I try to avoid those scenarios. Like, I think our product speaks for itself. But when we get in those situations, I see it all the time, and especially in the heavy guitar community, rock, alt rock, the
Mm-hmm.
core stuff. There's a lot of defaulting with drums, and
Mm-hmm.
that is, you get your tracks in, and without trying anything, you keep the overheads, blend the rooms in, and just replace
Mm-hmm.
everything else with samples.
Yeah.
Like, and it there's a point where, if a drummer's not good, and sorry, not sorry, drummer's not good, and he's just not nailing
Sometimes you have to.
the
Yeah.
shells, that's like, okay, you got to do what you got to do.
Yeah.
But or in the case of earlier in my career when I didn't have a good grasp of tuning drums,
Mm-hmm.
or getting like mics in the right place,
Right.
like, I get that. But when we're well past that, and when you
Mm-hmm.
spend hours tuning drums, and getting things to sit, and making sure your bleed is good, and
Mm-hmm.
you've got like a full thick tone on the toms and the snare and all that stuff, and then you send it off, and that character's neutered because somebody wants to get it in and out, or they
Mm-hmm.
don't want to put the hours in.
Right.
And
And
that's kind of where we are. It's not a fun place.
and that's the other thing that has happened with all this convenience of digital. I don't think digital is a bad word.
No, I think it's cool.
But I think when everything is a template, and you drag something in, there are, you know, we'll call them academies out there that teach um, this protocol of how to mix things. It's like, mix fast. It's like, that's great until like everything you turn out sounds the same.
Yeah.
Um, and I've even seen some of the who will go nameless, some of the teachers in this particular academy of which I speak,
There's a couple.
have gone back to analog mixing because they realized everything got so samey that it was boring, and it was, and so, my advice to anybody who wants to do mixing is, well, first you got to learn your fundamentals. You got to learn how to EQ. You got to learn how to compress.
God, it took me years to hear compression properly.
Right.
Worth it though.
Yeah. But you can do a lot with just your faders and your pans. Like,
No pots though. I mean, technically you have pots. All these are pots.
okay. How about the pan pot?
Oh.
Okay. But the learning how to like blend and pan. If you start there and you never template, that is the number one rule. Is what a template will do is it will like kind of paint you into a corner before you're ready before you even know what the song is like. I see these people all the time that have like these, drum templates. Hey, I drop my drums in. They come out sounding like, cannons all the time. It's like, well, what if that's not what the song wants?
I love when
You
I
know?
don't love it. I'll say love, ironically. I don't love it. I hate it. I effing hate it.
What are you talking about?
Ghost notes.
Oh,
When talk about cannon drums.
yeah, yeah,
When a home dude has all his samples, his velocities, his trigger settings all at 127.
yeah,
And the snare, the drummer's finessing the snare, and I hear, and instead
Yeah.
it's da-da-da-da-da.
yeah,
And
yeah.
that's just,
I mean, the better
That's
mixers
asinine.
that do this, they know better, but it's still, you're still hearing, Matt Halpern's on everything. It's like
y'all
Matt
better watch out.
Halpern.
If he wants royalties, y'all are all in trouble.
I know, man.
Metalcore is over.
Yeah, he could just be like, yeah, I want like credit for recording all these songs. That would be hilarious. I wonder if that's in the
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 EULA.
license agreement. Yeah,
I hope not.
that would be amazing.
That would be fun.
But here's the other thing: is like if you got a microphone and some drums, you can make your own samples, dude. And that's where we are. We're at the lazy end.
It's coming to a close, though.
Metal producers, by and large, are lazy.
Yeah, y'all lazy. I'm
Super
looking at you.
lazy.
Y'all are lazy. Stop being lazy.
Yeah, don't be lazy. But the thing is, nobody wants to come up with anything new. It's like It's like a mad dash for who has the, the most aggressive processing on the Nolly kit. It's like, dude, who cares? It's not fun. It's boring. Metal is the most boring genre right now. Nothing cool is happening in metal outside of like Sleep Token and Bill Murray. Like, and
There's a few other ones. There's a few other
yeah,
bangers, but I get what you're
yeah,
saying.
but like that's kind of it. It's like, okay, you might love Spirit Box. Okay, great. But they kind of sound like everything else.
All right, we have entered the hater phase.
Well, look, I mean, it is what it is. Um,
Oh,
Look, they've been
let's
doing the same thing for the past 15 years and haven't changed anything except for like added a little more low end. Like everybody got obsessed with like pop low end, and started adding synths and stuff. And look, I like that. I like low end, but it's like, man, why don't you just learn how to mix first? Like, anyway, yeah, metal is at an all-time low, and it's sad because it should be an elite genre, and I wouldn't be so upset about it if I didn't care. But
well, I think we're hitting a precipice because we're starting to see the paradigm shift.
yeah,
The laziness and the we'll call it the digicore
mm-hmm.
kind of thing that the 2010s brought to production. I think it's coming to a close. I think more and more artists are wanting to play their music. They're wanting to play amps. They're wanting to build sounds. I think we're going to start seeing more and more and more of that because, like it or not, the metal has become redundant, and people don't like redundancy. Like,
Well, it's not fun. Like
we
that's why record sales are down. Like it's
well, we're seeing the same thing in like, I was watching some Rick Beato stuff recently, and in 2023, I believe it was 2023. Please, correct me if I'm wrong, but we saw like a 23% overall listen decline on like the trap, hip hop, R&B genre,
mhm.
and those percentage of listens have moved into country, rock, and some metal. Like we're seeing a paradigm
Yeah.
shift. As well as like folk and indie. Like people are wanting more and more organic
Well,
stuff.
so what we're seeing right now and it's not like taking over, but man, India is having a comeback. Like,
Yeah.
any type of indie rock stuff is really having its heyday, right? Or it's like it's building. I can see it building. And I don't even know. Everybody knows what indie is when they hear it, but it's not an easily definable genre.
No, it's its own
Yeah,
thing with so many things that are
yeah.
their own things.
It's what would have been alternative in the 90s. You know what
Yeah.
I mean? So, um, but we're seeing a lot of bands form writing these songs, and I think that is the great thing about it, because another problem inside of metal music right now that nobody's talking about, there's a handful of dudes writing all the metal songs.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I mean it's as bad as pop music right now. So like you got all these ghost writers. Well, not all these. There's a handful of ghost writers writing everybody's stuff. Just like, we want a hit, so like, but we can't write. It's
I mean,
like,
it's
well,
kind
then
of
get out.
it's kind of like what happened to some of the big rock music in the late 2000s.
Yeah.
There was a lot of behind the scenes writing going
Yep.
on in that. It's not as bad as country,
Yeah.
not yet.
Well,
Hopefully
well,
not yet.
country's kind of honest about who wrote it though.
Oh yeah.
Like,
I mean, they're in the credits.
yeah. So like, you know, yeah, Chris Stapleton wrote a bunch of stuff, like, but what you see in country music though is you'll see co-writes between the artist and, more so now than like in the 90s. In the 90s, like, there were, dudes that just wrote songs
Oh,
and
yeah.
made millions of dollars. So now you see a lot of co-writes happening with artists. They want to be more involved in the writing process. Um, and I really do appreciate that in something as mainstream as country and bro country has kind of gotten. Yeah, it is a thing. Bro country is just like,
Well, that's starting to kind of run its course too, because
Yeah,
people are getting really bored of that.
yeah,
And the way I know that people are getting bored of it is that in the Carolinas, there's a lot of artists coming up now doing bro country.
yeah.
And what I've realized about some local communities, especially in these areas, and I don't care if I make enemies, I'm just going to be honest, there's a lot of people doing what was cool yesterday.
Yeah, for
And
sure.
that's how I know that times are changing. When all these guys show up doing, writing what was cool 4 or 5 years ago, or
Hmm.
trying to do that kind of thing, that's how I know, like, okay, we're changing. Things are
Right,
getting weird again
right.
because the copycats are like
Hmm.
more and more apparent.
Well, yeah, the lower forums are just copying what they're seeing happening in the charts now, and what's happening in the charts now was produced 2 years ago.
Yeah.
So, like you have to understand the cycle of popular music, and it's when you hear it, typically, especially in country, it could be a couple years old by now.
Oh yeah. That
So,
happens a lot. And I mean, we've got records and stuff that we've worked on that we finished years ago that just came that are just coming out.
right,
Like,
yeah,
it really, the machine, depending on where you are, the machine, it's not fast.
yeah, it moves pretty slow. And understandably so, because it takes a lot of momentum to get any kind of traction on a record. I mean, it takes a ton of momentum. So, like, there are pros and cons to just like releasing a record and then putting momentum behind it, or building a machine behind it and hoping you can push it. I have opinions on both, but that's another story. The but the thing that we're coming back around to is I think outside of like most metal musicians, um, most band type or most bands want to record their instruments. They want to play it in the room. They want to be part of the process. And that's the thing that I've seen that's been almost completely devoid from metal. Like, dude, there was a time when, drummers just didn't want to know if they'd been replaced or not, by a machine. And they didn't know.
There were some people just they they don't you don't know what you don't know, and you can't tell until it's pointed out, and then you can't unsee it.
Right.
You can't unhear it. Sorry guys, I'm sorry. We had to take a break.
Yeah.
We're back.
All right. Um, so tying it all back together, it's analog versus digital is a dumb argument. We've heard it a million times. I think we both know that it's a stupid thing to say because there are just instances where one is better than the other. But you have to experiment to know where that line is. In the beginning, the pros and cons of analog and digital. Analog sounds cooler. That's the only pro. That's it. That's all it's got. The cons are difficulty. Uh,
It's expensive.
it's yeah,
Maintenance,
yeah,
buying some of this stuff is nuts.
yeah. Time consuming. Um, and then it takes a lot more operational skills, and there is no undo
No.
for in the analog realm. So,
And the
yeah.
details matter so much. And if
Hmm.
you're not paying attention to the details, you can booger something up.
Yeah.
Every cable,
Hmm.
every input, every output,
Yeah.
every single piece is a point of failure. And if you're not on your P's and Q's,
Hmm.
you can't, like you said, you can't undo it.
Right. And so, um, the just putting an overhead mic in a wrong position, and all of a sudden your recording is in limp mode, you
Yep.
know. So coming back around, yeah, it's like way easier to get a decent production if you're programming your drums, if your guitars are DI into an amp sim. That's a way easier way of doing things, but it also doesn't teach you anything about what makes the music cool. And that's what's happened to metal is like the things that made it cool aren't even in there anymore. Like a dude beating the crap out of a drum set.
It's magical. It
Yeah.
is absolutely magical.
And you kind of automatically know those records that still have that when you hear them. There are a handful of really great drummers out there that do it that way. Um, I think part of the magic uh, of the Sleep Token movement is their drummer. He's
God, he rips,
he's
dude.
incredible and very insistent on natural sounding drums, even if there's like blended samples and things like that. Um, that's part of the core identity of Sleep Token. So um, I think in if you put all these things together, if you're trying to do demos or something like that, don't even bother. Go to a studio that has all the cool gear. Come to us. But but if you're just putting together your demos for your band and stuff, um, I don't know, man. I think every band ought to buy an X32 and track themselves and learn how to start putting their songs together based on real instrumentation. Um, it sure makes our lives easier when a band comes in with a cohesive demo.
I mean, that's what, I'm in a band and we take a similar approach. I'd like to start miking up drums for this next round of pre-production just out of like being a friggin' nerd.
Yeah,
But, we when we it's time to do stuff, we try to get in the room
yeah,
and then we bang it out. Like
yeah.
sometimes it's X32 when we can, and then other times it is, E-kit and mic some cabs and just hit it. Like
Right.
we
Yeah.
just you want to capture the essence of us
Yeah.
working together.
And when we're talking about, demoing songs and like writing as a group, um, just get it down, get it recorded so you've got the idea. I don't agree with the philosophy of like, well, if it's really good, you'll remember it tomorrow. It's like you might
You
not.
won't.
You might have just missed your path.
Sometimes you have to ride the wave while it's happening.
Hmm.
Like when lightning strikes, let it strike, man.
Yep. So, but you know, pulling it all back, it's a stupid question. Um, because the best thing to do is whatever the best thing for the music is. Um, there's no way we're not outfitted to do a hip hop record. We're not set up for doing super high end progressive EDM stuff. Hey, dude, have you seen Dead Mouse's studio? Like
It's sick.
like re- analog synths everywhere. Like that's not what we do. That's what he does, and he does it really good. At top tier because he's also obsessed with all these details and all this like how to capture sounds that make sense for every single production. So that's why you can't say analog or digital because it's really both. Everything's both. And I see it as like digital is the control, analog is the signal. So in even the way that I mix is very hybrid. I mix in the box because I'm working on you know 4 projects at a time. I'm
And we typically have an insane track count for
yeah,
most stuff. Not everything, but
right.
most of the time. By the time we get done with vocals and guitars and layers and production, I mean we're in the triple digits
Yeah.
easily.
Yeah. It's nothing for me to like look in our, multi-tracks folder and there be 200 tracks in there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I just finished a vocal session yesterday,
Yeah.
not counting the main vocals, just on the backing
Hmm.
choir, that kind of nonsense. 52
Yeah.
vocal tracks.
Yeah. And that's how productions are done these days. Like there's very few records out there that are like a left right guitar, drums and center vocal. Like that's just not I love that
That
stuff.
was fun. It's
Yeah.
fun when it comes through.
Yeah. But it's not the norm. So all these extra production elements do end up in these in records now. Partially because in the digital domain we can hear it. So like back when everything was tape and analog, you had a thing called signal to noise ratio. And there were some things that if you pushed it far enough in the background, you couldn't hear it because it was below the static. Yeah. So, um, that was also like a thing bands would have to think about is like, is this egg shaker part even going to be audible?
And now it is.
Yeah, and now it can be. So that's something that like the clarity of digital has given us. Now, if you've got here's something I do know. If you've got 200 tracks that you've tracked like from live instrumentation in the room or vocals or guitar cabs or whatever, and you have bad converters, you're going to have a really unpleasant sounding mix.
That's where the 4K is trash
Yeah,
movement
yeah.
comes from.
And depending on the converter, 4K for Focusrite, 3K for Behringer. Like I've heard these like build-ups. Um, and I'm also an advocate of using higher sample rates because it kind of moves the foldback frequencies, you know, out of the audio spectrum. So you get less of that in the first place. I mean, and that's a lesson for another day, but
That'll be on the next one or third one where we talk
yeah,
about
yeah.
editing.
Why is 96K better than 44.1 and Colt Caparoon's wrong? Like
That'll be later on.
I'm not gonna call. He's got great sounding recordings. He's another guy that does it the old way. But part of that guy's workflow is he's got a ton of outboard gear that he mixes through. So, and I don't have a ton of outboard, but we use a lot in capture.
You do a lot of committing.
Yeah. So, just do, compression on vocals and stuff in the, while we're tracking.
Dude, the day we got our vocal chain up,
Yeah.
and as I remember doing like running some heavy vocals back through it, and
We didn't use them for compression. We used them for distortion.
getting that
Yeah.
like distortion saturation because it was a little absurd. It was your idea. You were like 1176 into the LA2A into the
Yeah.
1176.
You're like, what?
And when it hit that
Yeah.
second 76,
Yeah.
and I remember like turning the input knob up and it started distorting in the
Yeah.
most cool, pleasant
Yeah.
way. That was the day I was like, yeah, there's nothing like this.
Yeah.
Like plugins are great.
And you can do that chain in the box, but it doesn't do the same thing.
And there's also the satisfaction of it, man, you put your hands on something
Hmm.
and you get to see, touch, feel,
Yeah.
you get a three-dimensional reaction.
Yeah.
Versus when you're in the box, it's two-dimensional. And the way it messes with your psyche in the real world is it's just friggin' cool. Like I
Yeah.
encourage everybody to try it.
Well, and the other thing is you can take that particular chain um, in the real world and stack it 100 times, and it doesn't get unpleasant.
Yeah.
Whereas if you do it with plugins, you will start hitting a buildup somewhere.
Get hash and
Yeah.
weird stuff.
And I'm not exactly sure where that comes from, and it might be very plugin specific, but um, there's every like LA2A and 1176 plugin that I've used, if I stack it enough times, like, with multiple parts, use the same chain on multiple parts, then it ends up with some buildup that has to be dealt with at the end. And that never happens with the hardware. I'm not sure why, but it just doesn't happen. So, um, and another place that I like to use uh, that I love the convenience of digital is in my, you know, analog components in my mixing chain. I have all of my compressors that I use for mixing on inserts so that I can dial in my compressor by just sending a little more juice to it. I know what compressors I'm going to use for kick and toms and, that kind of stuff. But I never really know how much signal it's going to need to do the thing. Well, you've got digital control of that.
Yeah.
So like that is that makes working in the analog realm much easier.
You get that consistency.
Yeah.
Because once your chain is set up, you get your threshold, input, output right, like
Yeah.
it's just getting signal to where it hits.
Now,
And
if you've only got one compressor and you have to use it for everything, this will not work. You have to like commit, print, and that is time consuming, but also worth it. So, but it is harder to dial in because you don't really know what's happening.
You're working one piece at a time,
Yeah,
so you can't see the
yeah,
forest through the trees typically.
yeah. Um, but I digital is awesome at recall. It's always the exact same, except for trigger. Trigger still pulls up the room sample on the kick drum every
Will
time.
we ever get Trigger 3?
No, no.
I believe
Steven
it's a
Slate's
myth.
done with us.
I believe it's a
He's
myth.
tired of us.
How dare he? In his chiseled jaw.
Yeah, I think he's a robot. Um, but that's another thing is like the ability to layer in samples. Like when you do a drum edit, drum edits are done all digitally. You don't have to cut tape anymore. You know,
That's terrifying. The idea of cutting tape and then taping the tape with tape.
yeah, exactly. So, but when you can do a drum edit and in the drum edit have your DAW make MIDI notes for you so that you can, blend in
Like
samples or
MIDI and blips
yeah,
and
or
trigger
yeah,
instances like it's
yeah. So, I like to use, a multi-band gate on drums to get them punchy. And I'm not the first dude to use a gate. Andy Wallace was known for um, for like gating the crap out of drums,
open the
and
gate.
then using reverb or a sample to make up the tail. So he'd use the gate to get the transient, and then a sample or reverb would be the tail. And he had some of the best drum sounds of all time. So um, that's but when you're using that type of gate, the easiest way to control it is with a MIDI note. So and if you need something to not open, like ghost notes or something, just delete the note. Like because go, ghost notes that go do 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 on the top head, stupid. Sounds so bad. Like I hate it. That's why you got to mic the bottom of your snare, you dummies. So, because that's where all the nuance comes from. No matter what your buddy said about micing the side or whatever, I don't care. If you don't mic the bottom, you're stupid.
It's top first,
Yeah,
bottom second,
yeah,
and then maybe
hmm
a shell mic. It
right,
depends, but
yeah.
I don't always go for one. Sometimes I do. It just depends on the genre and the snare
And
drum.
it also depends on how busy the kit is already, how much stuff is around. Because if you can't get the bleed out of that mic, it's almost useless.
Yeah.
So I think I used a shell mic, maybe like on the Knives record. We might have blended a shell mic into that.
My on the Blackwater record, we
Yeah, yeah,
did
yeah.
use a shell mic on that.
Yeah, yeah. But Chris was a beast.
God, he's
So
friggin'
anyway,
probably top 3 best drummers I've ever worked with.
mm,
Like that was the first time in my life. Second time where I had a drummer come in the studio and basically one take an entire record.
yeah,
The only we did 2 punch-ins on a whole album of extreme metal.
yeah.
And one was a fill that I was like, man, you could write a better fill. And he's like, yeah, I could.
hmm
And then I literally hit the record button and he just played a better fill.
Yeah.
And then the other one was it was a kick part where the guitars were doing something cool in a transition. And I was like, dude, you should play the kick drum there. And he was like, yeah, I should.
hmm
And then he just played it.
Yeah.
That was it.
Yeah.
2 punch-ins
Yeah.
on 9 songs.
Still down on himself, like thinking he could do better.
Oh
It's
man,
like,
it's
I
like,
don't
bro,
know how.
you can do different.
Yeah, but when it comes down to like making drums be an instrument, and that's something we've lost, I think, too, in heavy music, is like the drum set is an instrument. The kick is not an instrument. The snare is not an instrument. Um, this contraption is the reason it's called a kit is because it is one instrument with a bunch of mics on it. And what the whole drum programming thing has done for us is it's made every single piece of the kit a hyper focused instrument of its own. And it sounds ridiculous. it's just like it doesn't even make sense anymore. So, um, yeah, stop that. It's you know, I think nobody likes it. Even people that think they like it, they would like it better if it was like the real thing. So, um, and that's my drum rant. But getting back to the what does analog and digital excel at? There's if you can get your analog signal into the computer at a really high quality, then the possibilities are endless.
It's also accessibility.
Mhm.
What, and again, it's a double-edged sword, but it's the accessibility to be creative.
Mhm.
Like there, if you don't have a band or you can't find a band or you're in a position where you just want to be creative, like you can spend $50 on an interface
Mhm.
and even the most bottom tier computer now has enough horsepower to do.
The 599 Mac Mini is a beast compared to the high end, Mac Pro we were using 10 years ago.
Um, but that's the thing there. Like it allows you to be creative very quickly,
Hmm.
and that's yeah. However, with accessibility, and this is where it goes back to the issue with metal is that it removes the standard.
Hmm.
What was the standard, or we'll call it gatekeeping,
Hmm.
because now I mean, we saw the same thing happen with hip hop and stuff like that, where the point of entry
Hmm.
is so low, and that's
That the market just becomes like oversaturated with garbage.
like right now, that amp at the
Hmm.
very top, there are probably, if I had to guesstimate, hundreds hundreds of plugins
Hmm.
trying to do what that amp does.
Hmm. And if you've never played the amp and you've only played the plugins, go play the amp. It will change your life. Like
Change mine.
because that's a thing that can't, and this is what I'm saying is like there's an entire generation of guitarists that have probably never played an amp. And that's why I really appreciate like EVH doing the Iconic series. There's a sub $1,000 amp sounds pretty dang good,
Yeah.
and you can learn how to play an amp, and that is a different skill altogether. Because there are some guitarists that have come in here that have only played modelers or plugins and stuff like that. They have a really hard time getting a good sound out of an amp. Um, and we have to resort to some kind of tricks or using a more forgiving amp that might not.
Forgiving
Yeah,
guitar,
yeah,
like the EMG 8185 is
yeah,
old reliable.
because you can be a little sloppy with it and it's okay. An Evertune, somebody who doesn't have good right hand technique, you give them an Evertune and just tell them to beat it,
Yep.
and
Just beat it.
yeah, they don't have to have great technique at that point because the thing will stay in tune no
Yep.
matter what they do to
I
it.
mean, we've got two Evertunes. We've got a 6 and a 7,
Yeah,
and as much as they annoy me, they have their purpose.
right. So now that's not saying that everything's a tool, but I have never met like a really solid guitarist who loves an Evertune. You know what I mean? Um,
Well, I think that Evertunes are they are the modeler
of the
of
guitar world.
Guitar World
Yeah,
because they're convenient.
right.
As long as you don't have big humidity changes, anything like that, you literally, like my seven
You
string,
pick
because
it up and it's in tune.
I strung that thing
Yeah.
4 or 5 months ago
Hmm.
and set it up for drop A, and I could pick it up off the wall right now. I haven't touched the tuners on
Yeah.
it. It's still in tune.
Yeah. And that's the other thing is like if we're talking about tools, it's almost a digital tool. You know what I mean? So like if you're playing in a hardcore band and you're playing 4 nights a week on a grueling tour where you got 5 minute changeovers, an Evertune and a quad cortex, your best friend because you can be set up and ready to go in 5 minutes and not have to think about another thing. Everything is right there in front of you. And, that's where the tools make sense. Um, if if you can afford a little inconvenience, your your whole experience will change by using something that like fights you a little more. Like makes you play it as an instrument. And that's the thing about like, you know, a guitar with a fixed bridge or with a, floating bridge or something like that and a tube amp is you have to play these pieces as their own instruments now. Like you're playing the guitar, but you're also playing the amp, and
It's a whole series of
right.
things. It's like the guitar is its own thing. The
Yeah.
the amp is its own thing. The cab is its own thing. The room the cab is in is its own thing.
Hmm.
Where you mic it, the preamp, like all that stuff adds up into its own experience.
Right.
And it will change the way you feel, you react, like it impacts you on a psychological level far deeper than you
Right.
realize. Like all these things hit your brain in a different way.
Yeah.
Like it's one thing when you plug into a computer and you hear it through two 5-inch speakers. It's
Hmm.
another when, you know, 10 feet from you, the amp is turned up halfway
Yeah.
and the whole building is shaking. Like
Yeah.
you can feel it. It
Hmm.
literally like you physically can feel it.
Yeah. And we're still in a place where people are using acoustic drums live all the time. So there is where you have to like reach for to be, another problem that we're seeing though with the modular guitarist, modular guitarist, yeah, um, is the lack of stage volume, and
That's a whole other world.
it doesn't work for these smaller clubs because they don't have the ability to like front fill your guitar sounds. So you got your guitar sounds coming out of like two stacks on the side, and everybody's right here in the middle. All they hear is drums, and it's like it is really
Oh,
difficult
it's
to,
also really unpleasant.
yeah.
So this is what I see a lot in the people who commit to modelers is there's a lack of stage room.
Hmm.
So there's no push, there's
Hmm.
no three-dimensional hit to
Yeah.
your chest. Like
Right.
that's a thing you can feel in the room 100 feet back.
Yep.
That's the first thing. So you're physically missing a lot of the sonic. Well, yeah, we'll say like sonic field
Impact.
impact. Okay, that's the first thing. Second thing, modelers, depending on what PA you're running and how you have your stuff set up, they often, not all, I mean, some people live have got it dialed in, but
Hmm.
9 out of 10 times out of in a, we'll say semi-professional to local setting,
Hmm.
9 out of 10 times it's really harsh and unpleasant.
Yeah.
The minute you run an output into a PA and the sound guy's not paying attention and you just dialed your tone in because it's like, well, it sounds like my favorite record.
Hmm.
Well, maybe your favorite
You
record
downloaded
sucks,
a patch,
but
yeah.
it's harsh and unpleasant.
Hmm.
And so now it's hollow sounding. It's just drums and hash,
Yeah.
and nobody likes that.
Yeah. And we were watching I think Bill Murray's great.
They're great.
We were watching a Bill Murray concert the other day. There no cabs on stage, just modelers, and you know what? You really couldn't hear the guitars. You know what I mean? Like
Well,
huge stage.
they're also half a world away with no gear.
Well, I get it, but like I mean, there's rentals for everybody.
I suppose.
So like this is always how they play though. Like they always play this way. Um and you're just subject to whatever the sound guy does with you. I realize this is a cell phone video, but dude, I recorded a drum beat for my student last night on my iPhone sitting on the floor tom and sent it over to him, and it sounded like I recorded it in the studio. No excuses, okay? Sound guy just didn't have the guitars up.
Man, the mystery of iPhone processing.
Yeah, like somebody got to tell me about that.
Man, drums on an iPhone always sound really like
Yeah.
way better than
It's
they
like,
sound in real life.
How'd y'all do that?
It's like you literally film yourself playing
I
drums.
wonder if that's what Steven Slate's been up to lately. He's working with Apple on their like iPhone drum processing.
Oh man,
That'd be hilarious, actually.
is that why it's all kick 10 and snare 12?
Yeah. But so it can be a problem even on the larger scales. Um, and you could hear drums great. You could hear the sax just fine. Guitars,
Vocals were great. Yeah,
yeah,
the guitars weren't really that present.
yeah.
Fair.
So you've now put and look, we're not playing on those scales. We're not playing in front of 5,000 people. So like you're putting all of your trust in a sound guy that runs sound at a 200 cap venue for his day job. That's the guy you're trusting with your guitar sound? You sure about that?
Are you sure about that?
um, and so like I'm an advocate for like put your dang guitar cabs back on stage. Like, um, you can at least get drum sound out front because if the drummer hits them hard enough. Um, but you can do nothing if you're playing through a modeler with no stage volume. Um, and there are options to kind of do it. I've seen people play with like you know the FR cabs and stuff like that. But those kind of they're very directional. They're designed to be a monitor for the guitarist. They're not really designed to like create that wall of sound thing. So yeah, bring back the full stack, baby. That's all I got to say about that.
Amen. Amen.
So, but there again, we're talking convenience and control over man, that feels good. You know what I mean?
That's inappropriate.
You don't say that.
No, I
Yeah.
did. uh, yeah, and that's we live and operate in a world and in a business where we're adamantly working every day
Yeah.
to get the best of both.
Yeah. And just to like tie it all up in a neat little package. Um, the we operate in the studio the way we're both in bands. We've been in bands. Like and so we're out into the real. We're not disconnected from what's happening out there. And what the way that we operate in the studio is the hardest way to do it. It's the easiest hard way to do it because anything that shouldn't be a handicap we eliminate. There are processes that we have developed to make recording the hard way easier, if that makes sense.
Yep.
So, but anyone should try to record the hard way. Should try to like let's get these drums dialed in. Let's get guitar sounds we love. Let's really work through the bass parts and make sure that like they're locking with everything and it's not just like following the rhythm guitar and let's make the vocal harmonies like bloom in certain places to make motion and let's get out the synthesizer and like add some background pads and stuff. And this is the fun way to record music. It's not the cheap way.
No, it's definitely not cheap, and it's not easy.
Yeah, and it's not the easy way, but it is the fun way.
It is immensely rewarding. Like at the end of the day, and I believe all the people we're working with now will back this up. But it's like when you walk away from a session,
when you hear playback,
like that's your guitar,
Yeah.
that's your vocals,
Yeah.
that's your harmonies, that's
Yeah.
your layers. This is your music
Yeah.
with its own identity.
yeah,
And that's I wholeheartedly believe it. This is what music needs. This is what the world world needs, and this is what people need.
yeah. And I'm not some analog purist, but I've been through enough stuff to know uh, what it's good at and what digital's not. And so there are things you have to get away with, because you have to do it. But we don't have to do it.
Yeah.
So, um, so yeah, that's how I feel about that. We're gonna take another break. Missed. Well, you know, like tying it all back together. Are you serious? All right, hang on.
Oh, shit.
The blooper reel. You want your coffee?
There's nothing left but disappointment. Not the watch. Anything but the watch. Got him.
Did I?
Yeah, you did. You
Where'd
got
he
him.
go?
He did.